Let me get mic'd up here. You'll find that I have a pretty big mouth, but can you hear me in the back okay? Oh, good, great. I don't know who Earl was describing, but I think he needs a raise. Before we begin today, I would like to take just one moment and ask you, you heard Ed Clements up here who helped organize this. 43 years they've been doing this, 43, 110 talks. Ed and his devoted wife, Diane, have been doing this single-handedly with a lot of help from other people. But how about a quick round of applause for them for doing this? Thank you very much. Thank you, Diane and Ed. I would also ask you to take a look around the room. The fact is, you're here today because whatever you think of Common Core, good or bad, if you're not sure, if you don't know anything about Common Core, if you think you might like it, the fact is that it was put in your schools without you knowing it. They never talked to you about it until now. And as Common Core is reaching final implementation in your schools, only now are we having this debate nationally. Think about that for a second. Regardless of what your politics are, or your view of education, this has been handled in an extremely bad way. The people of New York are not paranoid for coming to talks like this. You are awake, and you should be. Absolutely awake over this. We have a huge disparity in the audience. Some people who really understand Common Core, others who need a little primer. So let's just start with a quick recap of what Common Core is. Common Core is an abbreviated term used to refer to the Common Core State Standards Initiative. You should know, one of the great lies of Common Core is that states had anything to do with it. They had nothing to do with it. No state legislator, no state governor, no state school boards, no local district school boards, no real teachers had any say in the implementation of this across the states. None. None whatsoever. Two small groups, and for lack of a better word, we have to call them lobbyist groups, because that's what they are. The National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers are responsible for the creation of the standards. They were funded to the tune of well over $150 million by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Bill and Melinda Gates are on record, you can look it up, they are on record as advocating not just for one nation education, but for one world education. Everybody, every kid in the world taking the same things in the same classes at the same time, accounting for time differences, time zone differences. This is the agenda. They've spent countless millions of dollars promoting this. And the money has been given to two small activist groups, lobbyist groups, Washington groups. The National Governors Association had almost very few, no actual sitting governors were part of this when these standards were written. There were some former governors of states who are part of the NGA who did not in any way, shape, or form participate in the creation of these standards. It was, again, a small group of activists and lobbyists. How did we get it then? How did we get it? How did 46 states in the Union find themselves, including New York, on the hook for Common Core without ever having a single public discussion about it? And you, moms and dads, I left you out. You weren't consulted about this either. How did we get it? Well, they tell you it's not a federal program. They tell you it's just standards, and it was written by these non-governmental groups. Well, right when they were being conceived and being funded, even before they had been written, the Obama administration created a program called Race to the Top. The Race to the Top program provided millions and millions of dollars of taxpayer funds to every state in the union. I've heard different conflicting numbers. I hear that New York took $300 million. Today I was told it was more like $700 million. $700 million. Think about that. Basically what you have with No Child Left Behind is a stimulus for the state education budgets. So the Obama administration creates Race to the Top, offers hundreds of millions of dollars to the states. The only proviso being, if you take the money, Common Core is the law of your state educationally once we finally write the standards. Before anybody had written them or anybody had even seen them, 46 states were on the hook for them. Two things you get for the money. Well, every state in the union, with the exception of Texas, who was running an education budget surplus, every state in the union was cash-strapped when it came to money. So they took the money. The other way that the Obama administration got people to take the money was to promise them a waiver from No Child Left Behind. So think about what you're getting here. Hundreds of millions of dollars of money. You're getting a waiver from No Child Left Behind, which was an absolute screaming disaster. I have yet to find a teacher, conservative, liberal, or libertarian. I have yet to find a principal, a teacher, a school board member who thinks No Child Left Behind is anything but disastrous and garbage. And yet, Common Core enshrines the worst aspects of No Child Left Behind. Rigid, inflexible standardized testing, one-size-fits-all education, tendentious incorporation of meaningless politics and sociology into otherwise apolitical classes. All of that we hated so much about No Child, all of that now No Child is Common Core on steroids. Plain and simple. Now, I want you to think about something. Regardless of your politics, I want you to think about something. If instead of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, it was the Koch brothers, and instead of a small group of left-leaning lobbyists, it was a small cabal of right-wing activists who crafted the standards. And if instead of President Obama, it was a very conservative president who put to get bribed states, basically, to accept education standards that apply to every single public school kid in this country. Sight unseen. If that happened, I would be as opposed to it as I am now. Would you be? Yeah. I think so. And you know as well as I do, the very people who are most championing this now would also be absolutely radically opposed to this. What's the difference? I want to say, by way of opening here too, it is important to point out to you that inevitably when we have these conversations, and this is a conversation, when we have these conversations, the tendency is to see us as somehow attacking teachers or attacking education, right? It's not true. The teachers had no say in any of this. The teachers that like it, the teachers that think it might be okay, and the teachers that hate it. They were handed this like you and I were. They're not responsible for this. All right? So this has nothing to do with, we know, you and I both know, that hardworking, good teachers can take any bad curriculum and make something of it. In the same way that bad teachers, poor teachers, can take the best curriculum in the world and make nothing of it, right? And so this is not an indictment of our teachers. It's not an indictment of our commitment as a nation to education. But think about how we got this for a second. Think about that. How your state got it. And as Ed pointed out, your Secretary of Education isn't helping matters, is he? By simply saying, I couldn't believe it. I saw the clip from the secretary. That bothered me. But then I saw Governor Cuomo's little statement after the fact a couple days ago, where he basically said to the people of New York, with all these questions and protests, basically said to the people of New York, Common Core is the future. Change is hard. Get over it. This is the way we're going. Staggering. In Wisconsin, my own state, we are now finally having hearings, even as the final nails are being driven into the coffin educationally. Now we're talking about it, right? You understand why this is a problem? Whatever your politics are, do you understand? I hope you understand why this is not the way to do business on something that affects ultimately every aspect of our society. At least Obamacare, whatever you think of it, at least it worked its way through the House and the Senate. At least it got its way to the Supreme Court. None of this has ever been accountable to anybody. And what's even more alarming about this, and I'll show you in the next slide, Common Core is copyrighted by these two groups. Up to 80, right now, 85% copyrighted. I'll show you the copyright. In fact, I'll show it to you now. There's the copyright. Which means our public educational curriculum guidelines are owned not by the people of this country, not by the moms and dads, not by the schools, not by the Senate, the House, or the Congress, not even by the Department of Education. These standards are 100% owned by lobbyists, funded by a billionaire with a stated political objective. Oh, and by the way, 1 month ago in the Washington Post, Bill Gates was interviewed about Common Core. And this is a direct quote, was asked about Common Core by the reporter interviewing it. And he said, it sure would be nice if we knew if our education stuff was going to work, but it'll take at least 10 years before we know. You can check that out too. 10 years, right? Experts and educators across the board have described this as a problem. You have those who are for it, but you never do hear, particularly in our media, particularly in the New York media, you never do hear much about the experts on the other side We're going to talk a little bit about them today. Well, we're going to start with the two chief lawyers for the Department of Education. Now, you know, right, that the Department of Education does not hire chief lawyers who are ideologically opposed to what they do. You get that, right? The Attorney General of the Department of Education and his chief assistant, the two top lawyers for the Department of Ed, they both argue that this is in violation of 3 federal statutes against the formation of a federal curriculum. Experts and educators have described the standards as common or mediocre, one-size-fits-all education. Again, this is no child. There's very little different here except one big thing. What was it that allowed us to get beyond no child? Well, local control of school boards and classrooms. How did we manage to transition out of no child? Well, because local teachers and local school boards in local districts recognized that it didn't work. Moms and dads knew it didn't work. And so from the ground up, a change was precipitated. The problem with Common Core, if it's fully implemented, is that goes away. Because once you get the de facto federal curricula, owned by people who aren't even accountable, what are you going to do to these people? They own the copyright. You going to subpoena them? How's that working out? How's the whole subpoena process working for the IRS scandal people? You see the insidiousness of this. On the one hand, they say it's not a federal curriculum, even though the federal government spent billions statewide to get people to adopt it, that the federal government, the Department of Education, is writing, and I'll show you some of it, is writing all sorts of curriculum to augment and parallel Common Core. All that's going into place. All right? Think about that for a second. And so what you got here? Complete federal control, right? Complete federal control of education, corresponding loss of state and local autonomy, input, and control, as well as parental control. Now, under No Child, a book is being taught in one of your classes or a subject matter is being taught, you have the right to opt your kids out. When everything becomes a national standard to which your kids have to adhere, how do you opt out of it? There are going to be things I'm going to ask you to think about. They don't want you to talk about this. Part of critical thinking is trying to think about what's coming. This is the part that they hate, because they want to shut down debate and say, all we have, Dr. Pesta, are the math and English standards. All this stuff you're suggesting, it hasn't happened yet, right? How'd that work out for Obamacare? You remember when they told you get to keep your insurance, you get all that stuff they told you that not even the people who pushed it through believe anymore? Was Senator Baucus, right? Max Baucus, retiring of Montana, who almost single-handedly was the president's scourge in the Senate to get this pushed through. He now came out, 6 weeks ago and said, it's a train wreck. None of this stuff is true. And when people said these things about Obamacare, you were told the same thing you're being told now. You're being paranoid, this is political, you're tinfoil hat wearers, critical thinking. It's going to be my chief contention that one of the main things wrong with Common Core is it's not about critical thinking at all. It has nothing to do with critical thinking. It's about control, right? So our two lawyers, with respect to the race to the top Common Core scheme, Robert S. Eitel and Kent D. Talbert, former Deputy General Counsel and General Counsel, respectively, of the U.S. Department of Education, concluded that, quote, these standards and assessments will ultimately direct the course of elementary and secondary study in most states across the nation, running the risk that states will become little more than administrative agents for a nationalized K-12 program, and raising a fundamental question about whether the department is exceeding its own statutory boundaries. Right? These are the two chief lawyers for the Department of Education. These guys are not right-wing kooks. The race to the top application, the initial vehicle through which Common Core was imposed on the states, requires that, this is what the language of race to the top says, requires that applicants adopt a set of content standards that are substantially identical across all states in a consortium. This means that states must adopt Common Core word for word. Right now they're allowed to supplement the standards by 15%. They are contractually unable to take out stuff, but they can add up to 15%. This is another question for you. Why do you think they allowed these initial standards? Why do you think they allowed 15% local control? Why do you think they allowed that? Do you think it's because if they gave you the standards as they are, people would be upset about them? You think about this. Common sense. Think ahead. If what they're aiming at is a rigid national standard, everybody getting the same thing, How can they allow New York to do things 15 or 20% different than Wisconsin? How can they allow Wisconsin to do things 15% different than Illinois? How can you do that and still have a national standard? How do you test that? When the standards, you're not going to get a test for every individual state. They're national tests. Those states aren't going to take into account what Wisconsin does different than New York. So ultimately, you can't have a national standard and have even that modicum of diversity. You just can't do it, right? There is no provision allowing a state to subtract anything from the Common Core standards. And furthermore, so what happened? States were bribed going in, and they're blackmailed if they want to get out. Here's the good news, that in the last 6 months, depending upon how you label it, and I'll explain that, between 16 and 22 states in this union have already partially, in full, or are beginning the process of getting out of it. Now you think about that for a second. You're going to have to add New York's name to that list, you know that, right? This is something to think really long and hard about. Now, not all of those states are getting out entirely. Let me give you a little background on this. There were 4 states in the Union 3 and 4 years ago, when this race to the top was first conceived. There were 4 states in the Union that were targeted as target states. They were designated target states. Millions, actually close to billions of dollars were handed out in promotion, we would say propaganda, for people to go into those states before the standards were ever written and seed the ground for them. The National Parent-Teacher Association, for instance, was given $1 million of grants in those 4 states to start lobbying for Common Core well before the standards were written, right? Those 4 states, by the way, those 4 rollout states were New York, Florida, Kentucky, and Virginia. So you are so much farther along than all the other states, right? Now maybe you understand why they're clinging to it so desperately, right? And that's $700 million. Will the federal government make you pay that back? But then you ask the question, how much are your kids worth, right? How much are your kids worth? This business here about those 4 rollout states, think about those 4, where this propagandizing has been going on for 4 years, before most of the money even reached the states. Kentucky, just last week, put a halt on any new standards coming in. They're having huge problems. Math and English are there. They've halted anything else. Florida, about a month ago, Governor Scott absolutely divorced what was happening in Florida he would not let the national testing go on. He divorced Florida from the national testing. And you understand that with no national testing, you do not have a standard, right? You do not have a national curriculum. That is huge. Virginia, the 3rd state, was one of the 4 states that thought it was so bad from the get-go that they never took it, even though they did all that money trying to agitate and promote it before the standards were written. So you see where you are in New York, right? Florida severed the testing. Kentucky's put a halt on anything else. Virginia said, no way. And you got the whole thing, right? Yeah. Right? And Georgia's one of those states. Georgia's one of those states that decided in a bicameral way, Democrats, Republicans, the House and the Senate, Georgia decided to pull out of Common Core about 2 or 3 months ago now. And the federal government said, you can do that, but we're taking back tens of millions of dollars in money we gave you. Money that had already been committed to teacher salaries, money that had already been committed to building improvements and computer purchases and sports teams. And so Georgia finds itself in a difficult position now. They don't want Common Core. But how do they not take it? Where are they going to get the money? Where do they get the budgeting from? So far, Georgia's held fast on this, but it's causing, you can imagine what a rift it's causing, particularly among teachers and among school faculty, right? And certainly the teachers' unions. You can imagine what a rift that's causing the people of Georgia for trying to get out of this now. And then we've got the whole one-size-fits-all education problem, right? All we have out there right now are the math and English standards. And there is so much evidence that these are going to be highly problematic. Right? We think about math for a second, and you've all heard fuzzy math, right? Well, let me give you one example. In Wisconsin, you should know that the validation committee, what Common Core did, these activists did, with very little teacher input, by the way, almost none. These two small activist groups did is they wrote the curriculum with Bill Gates' money, and then they brought in a committee of about 29 people whose job it was to validate the standards, to give them legitimacy. Right? The validation committee consisted of 29 different types of people, a couple of high school teachers, mostly activist politicians, and only 2 content standards. They only had 2 people who actually knew anything about standards themselves. One was Dr. Sandra Stotsky, an English language arts specialist, and the other was Dr. James Milgram, a mathematician at Stanford University. These were the only math and the only English person that had this kind of content background. They're the only ones they brought in. The only 2. Both refused to sign on to Common Core standards. Sandy Stotsky said it's going to set our kids back years. That one of the key problems with Common Core English, for instance, is it substitutes reading for writing. Kids do an infinitely higher level of writing, and reading gets absolutely watered down. And as every single piece of research we have on kids who learn how to read and write shows, it's got to be the other way. You got to have kids read more and more complex things, and radically complex things. Only then will they learn to write. Well, Common Core English absolutely flips that around. We've already heard how Common Core requires that 50% of all English literature, English language and literature courses remove half the curriculum and replace it with informational texts. Right? So they're taking out many of the great classics of the Western world, classics that require increasing complexity, but also the Judeo-Christian classics that expose our kids to the origins, the cultural history of America, the great literary tradition and poetic tradition of our country. And they're replacing it with things like the history of the grocery bag, Environmental Protection Agency pamphlets. One lucky 4th grade class gets to read a computer startup manual. Like when you open your new computer, get to read the manual. It's amazing when you think about it. So that was Sandy Stotsky. We flew her into Wisconsin. The math standards are even worse. Professor Jim Milgram, he also flew out. We flew him out to Wisconsin. You need to get those. They come. They'll come to talk to you, by the way. They will not charge you a penny. You reimburse them. Sandy's just up in Massachusetts. You want to do something really useful, you get Dr. Stotsky or Jim to come out here and let them tell you why it's bad English and bad math. These were the people that Common Core themselves recruited to verify their standards, the only mathematician. Now, as Dr. Jim likes to put it, there were math teachers there, but he was the only mathematician. All right? With all due respect, it's true of me, too, as a university professor. The fact that you taught 8th grade math or junior in high school calculus does not make you able to evaluate standards. It just doesn't, right? And so these are the 2 people, and they absolutely refuse to sign off on them. And math is even worse. I'll give you one example. Math pushes algebra from 8th grade into 9th. Every industrialized country in the world that's kicking our butts in math, all of them, they start algebra at 7th grade or even 6th. Right now in America, we do algebra at grade 8, which is, you understand why we're behind now? Common Core pushes algebra into 9th grade, which means our American high school kids will almost never be able to do things like calculus and higher math in high school, almost never. And that's by design, by the way. Yet they'll tell you how rigorous this is. There's nothing rigorous about this. The kinds of math that our high-achieving kids need to get into colleges, to be engineers, to do those kind of things, they're not going to be able to get it except in the most extreme circumstances now. That's a problem. Here's the philosophy of our Common Core math. And I'm going to warn you right now that the young lady here is a community activist from Chicago. Nothing could ever go wrong with that. And she's addressing a group of Chicago students, teachers, a group of Chicago teachers about philosophically what Common Core math is. Short little clip, I want to play it for you.
But even under the new Common Core, even if they said 3 times 4 was 11, if they were able to explain their reasoning and explain how they came up with their answer really in words and in oral explanations, and they showed it in the picture, but they just got the final number wrong, we're really more focusing on the how and the why.
Now, in fairness to her, you could find this clip on the internet. It's about a 3-minute clip. And a little bit later, about 40 seconds later, she's asked by somebody in the audience, but the right answers do matter, right? And she repeated what she said. They do matter, but it's the process. One of the key aspects of this Common Core math is the pair and share technique, where the teachers become, and you can imagine, with this kind of a curriculum, the teachers don't do much teaching, right? All the Common Core textbooks have this convoluted way of doing math in them. And one of the aspects of this is the parent share, whereby kids are put in groups of 2 and 3, and they're given a problem. And the purpose of the exercise is, first and foremost, to come to consensus. You get graded firstly on do you all agree what the answer is, and only secondarily on the right answer. We had a kid from New York, right? One of the things we do is we put together a school, an online school. And so we get moms calling us. It's not surprisingly, a fair number of the moms we've heard from about our online school are New York moms, places like New York and Kentucky, because you've had it for so long. We had a New York mom call us, and she actually faxed us the paper. Her kid, it was a second or third grade assignment, multiplication tables. 6 times 7 equals 42. Kid got the right answer, but he had the answer marked wrong, because the other 2 kids in his group didn't believe it was 42. And he got the wrong answer because there was no consensus. And you can sort of see this here, right? Right? The purpose and the principles of math are not right answers. And you see why. Look, I'm an English professor. I stink at math. Right? It didn't mean I couldn't excel in other areas. At least those students Earl made up on my behalf. They make you think I knew what I was doing, right? But what you got here is a curriculum, and I think this is an important point, a curriculum whose fundamental premise is postmodern, materialist. There is no truth. Not in math, not in science. It's all relative and subjective. You saw what happened out in California a couple weeks ago, right? Where Jerry Brown signed into law, a new law in California, whereby any kid in the public schools, from kindergarten through high school, any kid who thinks he's the opposite gender is now mandated by law to use the other bathrooms and cannot be stopped from going out for the other gender's sports teams. So if you're a 15-year-old boy who thinks he's a girl, you have to be allowed to go to the bathroom with the other girls and use the showers, and you cannot be prohibited from playing on the girls' volleyball team. That's the law. You'll see a little bit later in our program how Common Core, what's coming in Common Core, is going to absolutely enshrine that way of thinking. If even math is a matter of consensus and not fact, well, we know what this means for belief in God of any kind, right? And we certainly know what it means for things like gender. Even gender now is no real thing. It's whatever you think it is. How about one more I got to show you? I could spend weeks and weeks, if I don't fall off the stage here, weeks and weeks showing you clips like this. But just watch one. This is a little bit longer. It's a young girl whose mom is frustrated. We've had doctors. I have a friend in Green Bay. She's a medical doctor. She took calculus. She was so smart at math and science. She took calculus in 8th grade in a special program. She's a medical doctor. She said to me, I cannot help my 5th graders with math homework. Not because I don't know the math. It's because of the absolutely convoluted, counterintuitive way they make you do it. She said, it doesn't make any sense. And so you have a mom here who's suffering the same problem. And so her little girl is going to work a math problem. It's basically a simple add 3 numbers together problem. 1 number, 2 number, 3 number. Add them together to get the right answer. Watch how this plays out. Here's the simple math problem, just an addition problem.
So what I want you to do is, can you solve that problem showing me the way that you learned how to solve it in school?
Okay.
And talk to me while you're solving it.
So we learned that a big square like this is 100. So we could make that 100 into a cube, which would make 1,000. So I'm going to do that. Oh, no, I'm not. So let's just say that's 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
And now we still have to do 500. Could make that into 5 sheets. And we have 60, which are just lines of 10. 1. For her birthday, she got 1,000 X represent 1.
Okay.
So now we have to add all of these together. So you could make 1,000. All of these together is 400. Now you need 600 more. So now I'm going to write the numbers down. So we have 1,000 plus, or let's just say 3,000 because we have 3 cubes. 3,000 plus 100, 200, 300. So now we can erase all these sheets and hundreds and tens. And see. So we can just add, and that gives us a total of 3,763.
Okay. Now that problem you just solved took about 8 minutes.
Yeah, and
Okay.
that's what we're doing in school. But at home, I'm taught how to stack, and we're not allowed to do stacking in school. That's why we have to figure it out that way.
Okay.
So I'm going to stack these numbers, which is way easy.
What are you thinking? You're looking at your problems.
I got 2 different answers.
You got 2 different answers. What do you think happened?
Maybe I counted wrong.
Looks like you did the stacking correctly, and that took you about a minute.
So I think I did something messed up on this sheet.
What do you think happened?
Well, since that way was more confusing and it was like things were like all over the place, like it was hard to add them together because we had a lot of sheets and a lot of strips all on the board.
Yeah.
It was kind of harder to add them together. You need to be more organized.
More organized.
And this way is way more organized. I could just look at this information and wasn't as confused.
Okay, we can move forward. Out of the mouths of babes, right? There's a young lady who has a better grasp of this than the people who put all this into place. And you know, there are all, the what? Yes, they are doing it on purpose. There's no reason to do this. Well, think about it. If you're somebody like me who's not terribly math literate, right, you get to draw lots of pictures. I mean, you're not going to be any better at math, but you see what the objective is. That the purpose of math, the SAT and the ACT, the college entrance exams, have already gone over to Common Core. I saw a proto version of what the new SAT, now maybe it'll change. They're working on revising it, but I saw a prototype version of the SAT, what it was going to look like. Do you know what the first question of the math section was? Write an essay, a 20-minute essay on what math is. Now, look, I would love it if my kids could work math and could also talk about how they work it, but that's not what this is. In fact, one of the words they use again and again and again in the math curriculum is math fluency. I want my kids fluent in English, which we're not going to get from Common Core either. I want my kids fluent in English. I don't want them fluent in math. I want them to be able to do math. But by calling it math fluency, you see what it is. Math is more about words than it is about numbers, right? Math is more about talking and communicating and community and collective answers and no individualism and taking math away from the high achievers, because most kids can read or learn to read. Most kids, I couldn't. I am never going to be able to do higher math. And most kids probably won't either. What this is about is making sure that those high achieving math kids are no longer allowed to excel above their peers. You know, way back in the 1930s, Earl mentioned that one of the subjects I teach all the time is C.S. Lewis. Way back in the 1930s, C.S. Lewis got this. And of course, what was going on in the 1930s that in some way might parallel what we're seeing today was the rise of totalitarian and fascist attitudes to people, to who they belong to who your kids belong to. And way back in the 30s, as fascism was ginning up, Lewis saw it happening. And Lewis said, we can hope for the virtual abolition of education when the philosophy of I'm as good as you has had its say. right? This philosophy, even in the 1930s, that every kid has to be the same across the board or it's unfair. In other words, what Common Core is and what Lewis mentioned is outcome-based education. Do you see how, look, it's not being paranoid to point out that that's socialism. It doesn't matter what you put into something, it's what you get out of it. It doesn't matter if you try or don't try, you care or don't care, you can or you can't, doesn't matter. All that matters is on the outside, when it comes, the laundry's all done and you take it out, when it comes out of the wash, everybody is at the same place. What the federal government, if the federal government has a job in education at all, it is simply to guarantee that everybody has access to school, that's all. And I'm not even sure I'd go that far, but that's the most I'd grant them. But you see, rather than worrying about getting kids in, they're worried about what comes out now. You see how at utter loggerheads that is to traditional American values, right? You give kids opportunities. I was the first kid in my whole family to graduate from high school, and as often happens with us, we sort of like it. We get lazy, we go all the way, right? But the fact that I couldn't do math doesn't make me a bad guy. I know my limitations. Do you know how many math teachers I've had who patted me on the back and said, son, this isn't for you. Here's your pity C, right? Because you'll never graduate college without it. Here's your pity C. Now don't take another math class. And that was the best advice I ever heard. Right? Because it allowed me to focus on things that I could do. But in this curriculum, you can't have that because the standard in every area has to be the same. And you know what happened with No Child Left Behind, right? Do you remember in Georgia and Kentucky and Virginia? Do you remember what happened? Where you actually had teachers and principals and superintendents on these nationalized tests, throwing the tests in the garbage and rewriting them so their kids could pass it and submitting the false tests? Or completely erasing answers from their kids' papers because it's high-stakes testing. The kids aren't going to get fired. You are, right? And so you understand the pressure. And so what ended up happening with No Child Left Behind? Because you couldn't possibly get all the kids to the standard. How many of you have more than one kid in your family? Or grandkids? Well, look at that. Is it possible to get 2 kids in your family to excel the same way in the same subjects? Is it not true that if your first kid's a math geek, the next one's going to be anything but a math geek? Isn't that how that works? And if you can't buy the same toys, or the same coloring books, or the same books for the same kids in your family because they don't have the same interests, how are we going to do this with 100 million kids over the next 10 years? How are you going to do it? You can't do it. And so inevitably what happens is what happened with No Child Left Behind. They had to keep walking the standard back. How is that not going to happen here? How can you envision a circumstance in which it does? You'd have to completely rewrite human nature. And of course, that's kind of what Common Core does, right? This business about standards and numbers, if it's dangerous. And I'm not saying, by the way, a good mathematician, a really good math teacher couldn't make something of this. But the one thing we keep hearing about over and over again from all these moms is, I don't know, I can't help them. I had a math tutor, professional math tutor, come up to me. I gave a talk in Wausau, Wisconsin, a couple days before I came here. He came up to me and said, I can't make heads or tails of it. I can't understand. It just doesn't make any sense to those people who, and this is why so many kids are frustrated with it. Because math is a very analytical thing. There's nothing analytical about that, is there? It's completely representational. With all that sort of drawing. They have kids counting knuckles, all the different knuckles on the hand, and oh man, we had the stories, I got to be careful. I could keep telling you these stories over and over again. With regards to the math and what the moms are saying about the math, the single biggest problem is that it's so counterintuitive. They have all these little kids, particularly little boys, who have really liked math, but they can't stand it now. We had one little boy, his mom was in Connecticut. He was 7 years old, loved math, loved going to school. They put this in there, and he started having violent reactions. They literally had to drag him out of the car and into class. And he kept running away. And it was all because this just made no sense to him. It just fried his brain. One of the great problems with Common Core is the age inappropriateness of a lot of these lessons. The kind of things, they have kids reading less good literature, but much more politically and psychologically problematic literature. I mean, I know a lot of you came up to me before the talk and mentioned exemplar texts like The Bluest Eye. And here's how they get around things for English. Common Core does not require any books to be taught. What Common Core has done is create a list of exemplary texts. In other words, we aren't going to tell anybody what to teach, but these are the only books we approve. And so what's happened is the textbook companies have run into that void and started putting together Common Core textbooks with all those things in it. And that's how they tell you. Another great lie of Common Core. It's just a curriculum. These are just standards. I mean, it's not a curriculum. It's just standards. They're just recommendations. Yeah, but good luck finding a non-Common Core textbook anymore, number one. Number two, good luck finding a Common Core textbook that doesn't exclusively include the exemplars from their list. And some of you have mentioned The Bluest Eye, right? The Bluest Eye is a novel she's a great novelist, African-American novelist Toni Morrison, Nobel Prize winner. We wouldn't teach that to college freshmen. It's a great book, but it's way, way over those kids' heads. Juniors in high school, it's a book about rape and incest, all told from the perspective of a 12-year-old girl. And she comes to enjoy it and describes in graphic detail the contact between him and the older man who abused her. And this was and there are dozens of these stories that are littered throughout the Common Core exemplar text. Right? I mean, dozens of examples of all sorts of really age and grade school, elementary school inappropriate. To give you one more example, one of the key components of almost every single exemplar text in elementary school, every single exemplar text in elementary school has some component that undermines parents' rights over their kids. One story for second graders. It's called The Case of the Gasping Garbage. You got two little 7-year-old girls who are detectives, Hannah Montana types, right? That ended up well, speaking of ending up well for Miley Cyrus, right? You got two little girls, 7-year-olds, and they're out solving crimes. And they call their mother up and say, Mom, we're on a case, we won't be home until after midnight. Tells Mom, that's right. Everything in the curriculum is geared towards this. You've seen some of these Common Core assignments where they're having kids now, we had one in Wisconsin, where they sat kids down and had them write an essay, you can see them online, had to write an essay where they explained how government was just like family, only better. That government does everything family does for you, just better. This mandated cooperation with Obamacare, this is another one of those things that they'll say, I see, you just hate Obama. No. Remember who it was that gave us No Child, right? It was George Bush. George Bush farmed it out to Teddy Kennedy. No Child Left Behind was George Bush, as I said, had a problem. This is a bipartisan issue. I'll give you one more bipartisan example. We've got two Republican senators in Wisconsin who are single-handedly tried to stop us as a state from even having the hearings. Senator Luther Olson and Congressman Kestrel. And we found out, this was actually read on the State House floor, why were they so adamantly for this? Turns out that Senator Olson's wife is a highly paid 6-figure salary for CISA, the organization who is paid to implement Common Core in Wisconsin. So Senator Olson's wife gets paid by the CISA group to put the standards in. And this will scare you. Those two Republican congressmen have floated a bill. They've introduced a bill into the Wisconsin State House. Listen to this. According to the Olson-Kestrel bill, now everybody tells me, my connections to the State House tell me it has no chance of getting passed, but it's two Republicans who are trying to push this. The Olson-Kestrel bill says that any private school, any Christian or Catholic school that fails the Common Core national test for more than 3 years in a row, that school will be taken over by the Wisconsin Department of Education and administered. Now you think about that for a second, and if you're a homeschool mom, or a Roman Catholic educator, or a Reformed educator, if that's you, and you manage to somehow not expose your kids to this, then your kids have to sit down and take those state tests, and your kid could be the smartest math kid in the room. How are they going to do that? Another example, we had another math mom called us, somewhere on the East Coast, I think this was the Connecticut mom, called us, and had a situation where her kid got the wrong answer, some kind of math or division problem, and the answer was 68. And turned out that he got marked wrong, she got marked wrong, that little kid got marked wrong because she didn't draw 68 circles. That the number was unacceptable as an answer, that it had to be done visually, right? Now, if you're a private school mom, a Christian Catholic school mom, homeschool mom, you think about this when your kids sit down and take those tests. You see what's coming, right? Because what's coming here is your kid, well, gee, for all these years, private schools, Catholic schools, public schools, or Protestant-based schools, all these Christian schools, they've been outperforming the public schools by light years. And now, in the last 3 years, they've really gone in the tank. And you see what two Republicans are trying to do in Wisconsin. Those schools that don't perform well, we take them over in the interest of our kids. And I'm going to get to this Obamacare stuff and you can figure this out already, that everything now is health. You guys live in New York. You guys live in the land of Bloomberg, right? With your big soda bans and your home delivery pizza, but all that you see, right? The big nanny state. Well, you now know, right? Everything's health. That includes educational health, educational wellness, educational well-being, right? Did we mention it? I haven't mentioned Indiana to you yet, have I? Indiana is one of those states in the Union. My colleague Mary Black lives there. And Mary was very instrumental in getting the state of Indiana to halt Common Core. They couldn't get out what was in there because, again, all this happened. You see how long, you understand why they waited so long to roll it out when it was already 90% implemented? You're having this conversation now, and it's already fully implemented in your schools. How many of you, can I just ask you, how many of you are for the first time hearing any of this? Look at that. Look at that. It's already de facto, it's your schools now. And the reason they waited to do this is precisely because of this. And so in Indiana, they wanted to stop it. It happened in Wisconsin, too. When they finally looked into it, they discovered that the math and the English were so far advanced they could. How do you stop in the middle of a semester now? And then tell them to do what? Where are you going to get the textbooks? So Indiana couldn't stop it, but what Indiana decided to do was halt the other stuff and begin the process of getting rid of them. Same thing in Wisconsin. Indiana, in spite of the fact that they've begun to get rid of this, you're not going to believe me when I tell you this, but you can look it up online. Indiana has already had warrantless searches based on Department of Education, but based on teacher and administrator recommendations. Because it's under Obamacare, under some of the statutes in Obamacare, education is a health issue. And consequently, if a teacher or an administrator or a principal, your kid shows up to class and he's usually getting A's on all his quizzes, but for 2 days in a row he gets C's or D's, or he's usually smiling and chatty, and then you find him not so smiley and chatty. Well, something's wrong. And this alone will enable one call to the educational administration in the state, will enable a absolutely warrantless home search to find out if your kid is okay. Warrantless home searches based on educational health. It's already happened in Indiana. It is unbelievable. Oh, you all heard the story from North Carolina last year. The little girl shows up with her lunch. You know this one? The little girl shows up with her lunch, a little brown bag lunch. She's a middle school kid. And the lunch contained a turkey sandwich, a bag of chips, apple juice, and an apple, I believe. That was her lunch. There just happened to be a federal lunch agent in the cafeteria. That alone, the ability that we can say federal lunch agent, right? That should just, right there, we should just quit now and go storm the barricades, right? Just for that alone. But this federal lunch agent determined that was an unhealthy lunch, threw it in the garbage, and required the little girl to go get the lunch for the day and build the family for it. And a lot of hands raised up. And what was that nutritious lunch that day? Who remembers? Chicken nuggets. There you go. All right? Every part of the chicken except the white meat. All right? That's what she ate. Federal lunch agents. This stuff is going on already. And so I don't want to keep you to midnight. I'm going to skip through some of the boring Obamacare slides where all the stuff that falls under health now and how you'll see more slides on this a little bit later, I'll show you them, how all this stuff becomes a health issue now. And it makes sense, right? It makes sense with regards to this. And so this next question, if everything is a healthcare issue, and the state now, why are you seeing assignments like this, right? Why are you seeing Common Core textbooks that seek to divorce parents from kids, that seek to assert the authority of the state? And you've heard, Melissa Harris Perry on MSNBC say, you've got to get beyond the fact that your kids belong to you. They don't, they belong to the community, right? The kids belong to the community. They don't really belong to you. Or you see this rhetoric, they're more brazen about it now, right? They're not your kids, they're the state's kids. And so if Obamacare does have this legislation in it that enables this, I'm going to tell you one more horrible story. I was going to tell you sooner or later. Got to tell you this one. I'm trying to get the bad stories out so I can leave you with some hope. So there's a method to my madness. My 12-year-old niece goes to school in Texas. Texas is one of the 4 states that, like Virginia, refused to take any Common Core. And yet, the state teachers union had been slipping in aspects of Common Core unbeknownst to the legislature or the governor. Right? Nobody knew about it. In fact, Texas had a program called C-Scope, which is a forerunner of Common Core. Now, as soon as one of the stories I'm about to tell you, as soon as this all became known, a couple months ago, the Attorney General looked into it and got through C-scope out of the curriculum. But it was already in there. Among the assignments of C-scope in Texas were to require 4th grade girls to show up to class dressed as Muslim girls in full burqas. There was no corresponding Jewish Appreciation Day or Christian Appreciation Day, right? Just simple Muslim outreach. American girls, 14-year-old girls, dressed as Muslim girls, completely covered head to toe. Another assignment for 3rd graders was a 3-week lesson on the merits of communism that included as an assignment, you can see the pictures online, that included going home and creating a brand new flag with construction paper and markers for a brand new communist country. I've seen the pictures. I should have thrown them in here. Imagine an American flag with the blue stars taken out and the Soviet hammer and sickle put in its place. That's what these kids came up with, right? So my horror story. My 12-year-old niece received a letter in the mail this summer that said she wouldn't be allowed to go to school, and any of her female classmates, 12 years old, unless she got a gynecological exam first. My sister is, God bless her, she's a little confused. She's also a little sick, but she sent the kid to get this exam. The gynecologist said, "You're too young, I can't examine you," and then proceeded to give her a half-hour lecture on sex unsolicited. That's bad enough, but why? You ask why. Well, think about this. It makes sense because of this. Why is the schools requiring this? Well, under Obamacare, your daughters can get abortions, they can get abortifacient medicine, they can get birth control without consulting you anymore. Right? Under Obamacare, teachers and schools can drive kids to abortion clinics, kids of any age. But the one thing they can't do is require your child to get a gynecological exam. That's not in the provisions. And no doctor can prescribe birth control to a kid who hasn't been examined. Now you see what's going on here, right? Now they've got a baseline for all these little girls, a baseline medical exam. Now they don't need to go to the parents. Now the whole thing's set up, right? And that's in Texas. That's not in, Oklahoma. That's not in some Massachusetts or California, some other hippy-dippy state, right? Excuse me. All right, hippy-dippy's not a bad word. But that's this data mining stuff. Where's the hope? Data mining. And so all this means is that because of Obamacare, the schools are now responsible for collecting all kinds of information. This is the elaborate facility they've built in Utah to house this information. Here's another thing to think about. Remember when you had a bad day in school? You'd show up to school and the girl you were in love with loved somebody else. So you failed a quiz or two. You moped, very emo. And you righted the ship, and at the end of the semester, you got your A. And all that was ever recorded on your report card was your grade. Now, every single exam, every single test, every single assessment, every single personal comment that's written about you, that's going to become part of the kid's permanent record for the rest of their life. And they've already mentioned that one of the things they want to do in terms of building a better workforce is allow employers to consider this record. So something you did now in 4th grade or 6th grade or 7th grade, some bad semester you had, that now is part of your permanent record. Think about the horror of that. Data mining, this is the big facility, right? I won't spend a whole lot of time. This goes on for about 15 pages of all the different things that they're going to ask your kids. We had one mom, and guess from where? From New York, whose daughter, 13, before I do that, here is promoting grit tenacity. This is not a federal curriculum, oh no. This was written in February 2013 by the Department of Education, but it's not a national curriculum, right? February 2013, this is the title of the document, Promoting Grit, Tenacity, and Perseverance. And by the way, that's what I want from my kids. I want them to treat education as something you have to survive, something to grit your teeth and get through, right? This is how we're going to do it. Critical factors for success. This is the document written by the Department of Education that includes these pictures. These are the effective sensors by which they're going to monitor your kids. These are the ways they're going to begin to collect data on your kids. You've got the facial expression camera. So they give you a school laptop, and they put a camera on it to watch you watching your lessons. And you think about this. If an unpleasant lesson comes up, or an unpopular lesson comes up, or if they're trying to do any of that sociological indoctrination and your kid balks at it, well, they can have a record of that. Intervention. The slouch posture analysis seat. When certain issues are brought up in class, do your kids slouch or crinkle down? Do they seem upset? The pressure mouse. Is your kid grabbing the mouse harder? Or one of the more insidious ones, the wireless skin conductance sensor, which sort of monitors pulse and heart rate. This is the little girl from New York. Had one of these strapped to her wrist. The only reason Mom knew about it is because she had an angry purple welt on her wrist. They had it on too tight. And Mom was like, what did that happen? Oh, Mom, they pulled me into the office and started asking me questions, and they had that hooked up to her. Among the questions they asked her is, are your parents politically active? Did they vote in the last election? Who did they vote for? Are there guns in your house? Would you feel safer if somebody went in and took those guns away? And about 500 other questions, right, as part of this. You know, we've already heard this, that under Obamacare, when a lot of kids go to their doctor visits now, the doctors are asking them those questions too. You've seen this, right? These forms about guns in particular. Are there guns in your house? Are you scared of the guns, right? So this is crossing over. Do you feel safer? Right, exactly. So these are all, we have one county in Pennsylvania, when kids went back to school in September, one Pennsylvania county wrote a letter home to the moms and dads and said, there will be no school supplies. You bring nothing to class. Your only school supply is a laptop computer that we're going to give you and charge you $650 for, which is what they did. Those laptop computers were equipped with absolute state-of-the-art NSA quality data surveillance, keystroke surveillance, global positioning systems, so the ability to look at certain times back at what your kids were looking at you. Right? That was the only required school. This is happening all over the country now, this stuff. Among the other things, and this is one of those areas where we have to consider what's coming. It's a Trojan horse, right? We've already talked a little bit about Agenda 21. Bill Gates has made it abundantly clear what his attitude toward that is, right? That American sovereignty is a problem. The idea that we have nations with borders is a problem. The idea that we have a system where religion functions as much as it does in this culture. The fact that we have a system where moms and dads are considered the primary responsible people for their children. That's all got to go, right? Bill Gates has made that clear. But worse than that, you've got Planned Parenthood, who has been given millions of dollars of federal grants to begin to write curriculum to augment Common Core. Another group who I didn't list here, another group called GLEN. It's gay, lesbian, something, something. I keep forgetting the acronym. You should look them up, GLEN, G-L-E-N-N. They have created a curriculum that's going to be implemented later in Common Core, which mandates that every single class from kindergarten through high school has to incorporate gay-friendly examples or language. Now, let me say this right from the get-go. As an American, I want you to have whatever view you want to have on that question. It's not for me to tell. You believe what you believe. But is it up to the schools to determine these questions for you? Why do the schools get to mandate what your kids will learn about this? You see how much parental control is being lost here, right? Your kids go to Christian schools, you raise your kids Christians, Muslims, Orthodox, you raise your kids with a certain set of beliefs. Now, for the first time in our history, if those beliefs contrast with the orthodoxy of what schools are teaching, now we've got a problem. Now you understand why you got the facial cameras? If, as you're going to see in a moment, if as young as 5 and 6 and 7 years old, they've written sexuality standards for your kids, and what they're teaching your kids about homosexuality conflicts with what they've learned at home, now do you see why they're monitoring your kids' reactions? And what now becomes criminal? What now becomes intervention-worthy? That's a big problem, isn't it? So in other words, with the GLEN curriculum, even things like math and science. So they've got to make sure you include gay-friendly and gay-promoting examples, illustrations, and even if you think homosexuality is the greatest thing in the world. Absolutely, if you think that's fine. But what business does the school have to determine definitively what that means? We're going to see the standards in a moment here. But with regards to the United Nations, we talked about that. But GLEN, so if you've got a math class, no longer can it be Johnny's mom has 2 apples, Johnny's dad has 3. It's got to be, right, you got to, Johnny's one dad, Johnny's other dad. You've got to make every single class, even gym class, you have to make a concerted effort. And I was talking to somebody here beforehand who's a musician. He's a music teacher, right? And he's already begun to feel some small pressure about Common Core. You'd think music would be, but there's already curriculum being written about by the NEA, National Arts Education, that mandates that you have to spend some time in music class teaching the sexuality of the composers, right? As a way, that's how you get it in. That's how you get it in, right? So you got all these Trojan horses. Here. You tell me this isn't a federal curriculum. You look at the language here. This was written in September of 2012. These are the national sexuality education standards, and I didn't write it, they did. Core content and skills. You know what I'm going to say, right? Because you send your kids to public school to learn sex skills, don't you? That's what you want them to learn. But that's how they label this, right? This is shocking. You can see all this online. And they're going to keep telling you, and it's very dishonest. When we bring this to school administrators, they'll say, oh, you're crazy, we won't adopt that. Oh yeah? You're going to take everything else, but you're going to stop here. You're going to go in 95% on Common Core, and you think you're going to be able to draw a line on this? What makes you think that? Boy, talk about putting your faith in the wrong places. Here are some of the standards. Now these, I'm going to skip this one, I'll go to this one. By the way, all these slides, at the very end of my presentation, the last slide up there will be our email address. And I mention it only because you can get every single slide on this list. You can go to our website, you can download them free of charge, you can email them to people free of charge, you can print them out. I urge you to do your own homework. It's all free. So if you want this stuff, so anything that I skip over or anything that you can't see very well, you can get it. But here are the standards. What they do is they break up sexuality education into groups of 3. So from kindergarten to 2nd grade, K1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and up. And for every 3-year cycle, there are a set of standards that kids have to meet, like any other standards, before they can be promoted. And if you look here, right? So for kindergartners, 5-year-olds, you have to begin to identify different kinds of family structures and demonstrate to show ways to show respect for different types of families. Now that sounds awfully benign. Respect is a good thing, but 5, 6, and 7 years old, and what are you going to do? What are your kids, is it possible for your kids, according to the government, is it possible for your kids to show respect without being 100% committed to gay and lesbian activist causes, is it? I don't see how it's going to be. Another example from Denmark, Wisconsin, a school in Denmark. We had a mom, I gave a talk in Denmark, and a teacher was there, and she brought her sister. And her sister's daughter was with her. Turns out that the mom went into the book bag, the kid's book bag, to get something, and stumbled across this little cardboard card. And on this card was written, I pledge to support and promote homosexuality every year I'm in this school, and I will stand firm against any discrimination against gays whatsoever. And they had to sign it. They pledged to, for the rest of their school years, to become activists. They were turned back into the teachers they were supposed to be. For whatever reason, this little girl kept hers and dumped it in her bag. That's the only way the mom found it. Turned out that when she held the card up at the meeting, and a bunch of other moms raised their hand and said, that's what my daughter told me, but I didn't believe her. So the thing about Common Core that's happening more and more, so much of the more tendentious stuff, it's not coming home anymore. They're not sending home assignments, they're not making the kids do homework on this, right? Because it's not about you, it's about them. Look at some of the arguments here. How about this one for kindergartners? Describe differences and similarities in how boys and girls may be expected to act. You see what we're getting at, right? Sexuality, male and female, they're all just constructs, right? The next one, I would not assign this to a freshman in college. It's too complex, it's too complicated. The next one, for 5 and 6 and 7-year-olds, you are to provide examples of how friends, family, media, society, and culture influence the ways in which boys and girls think they should act. 5, 6, and 7. By the end of 2nd grade, there's better examples. If you get a chance to type that document into your computer, you take a look at some of the standards. Here's from grades 3 to 5. So by the end of 5th grade, these are standards, which means you have to meet the knowledge. By the end of 5th grade, kids will define sexual orientation as the romantic attraction of an individual to someone of the same gender or someone of a different gender. That's how you're going to define it. And if you don't define it that way, you are in violation of the standard. How about this one? These kids are, 5, 6, these are 8, 9, and 10-year-olds. These kids have not gone through puberty yet. Yet for 3 years, they're conditioned to learn things about puberty, right? So you're going to, by the end of 5th grade, you're going to explain the physical, social, and emotional changes that occur during puberty. You're going to describe how friends, family, media, society, and culture can influence ideas about body image, and you're going to identify medically accurate information and resources about puberty and personal hygiene. I ask you, what does any of this have to do with school? Any of it? And I get it. I get that we live in a fractured culture. I get that we live in a culture where there are lots of single moms and absent dads. I get it. But is that an excuse to turn schools? In Wisconsin, in places like Memphis, Tennessee, and in my own Green Bay, Wisconsin, they have taken to providing breakfast, lunch, and dinners in the schools because there are some kids who don't eat enough. And then they decided that it's not fair to provide them just for the poor kids, so that every kid in the district in Green Bay can get free breakfast, lunch, and dinner at the school. And then they determined that it's not fair of us to give it only during the school year because kids are hungry in the summer. So all year round in Green Bay Public Schools, you can get taxpayer money, you get breakfast, lunch, and dinner, everybody. Remember what Lewis said? I didn't finish my quote. Remember what C.S. Lewis said? You can hope for the virtual abolition of education when I'm as good as you has had its way. In other words, when this philosophy that everybody must always get the same thing at the end, when that has its way, there's no such thing as education anymore. Teachers, he said, become glorified babysitters. And that child, capable of reading Aeschylus and Dante, is chained perpetually to his coeval, who barely can spell out a cat set on the mat. When that day happens, Lewis said, education is gone. And of course, Lewis was writing in the context of fascism. That's what fascist states do. Right? Again, why? What does any of this have to do with it? And you see now, the standard now is not what you teach your kid. The standard is not something anymore that people of good faith can disagree about. The standard is not something anymore that you get to determine for your family. The standard is what they tell you. Right? Pretty shocking stuff. We can go on and on again. I don't want to spend too much more time on it, but the bullying part of this curriculum. Anything that does not conform to the standard, any worldview, is bullying. And you know the irony, I tell this all the time I give this talk, I would much rather have my kid, I'd much rather have my kid have his lunch money stolen by a bully every single day he goes to school than to have the full force of the federal government coming. Who are the bullies here? And yet the one thing you will never see defined as bullying is those standards, right? Socialist style, we've already talked a little bit about this. You see, it's outcome-based, right? It is utterly counter. That's why things like they're rewriting, sir, right? They're rewriting the Bill of Rights. They're rewriting the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. They're getting rid of it all because there's nothing in it that justifies this. So our kids are being taught it's a faulty, flawed document. They're being taught that the Bill of Rights are antiquated and unfair. And we must update them with things like the government should feed every kid every day. Some of the ones that there's Bill of Rights things that they're substituting in, right? And that's how they're working it. So you get this. Our country became the most prosperous and the most educated country in the history of the world. Why do we become that way? Freedom of opportunity. All right? Let kids make of themselves what they can and have moms and dads. And you know, I got to tell you this. For those of you who are biblically minded, the Bible and common sense both tell us that you are the primary educators of your kids. You. Not schools, right? And you know, I hear from Christian moms and dads all the time about, our kids are going to be a beacon of light. Our kids, we raise them right, we pray with them, we take them to church twice a week, and these kids are going to be beacons of light in a hostile. And you wouldn't send your 12-year-old into the jungles of Borneo. You wouldn't do it. Right? The idea that these kids are going to be missionaries, they're getting eaten alive, and even if you spend 4 hours a night reading the Bible and praying with your kids, they've got 8 hours of this. And even if you are, and I've said this before, we've got a lot of good teachers who want to do the right thing. How do you get around a curriculum like this now if it's all standard-based? We had one teacher in Green Bay who said to us, she quit. I couldn't do it anymore. She was a third-grade math teacher, and in a Roman Catholic school using Common Core. And she said, every day when math came up, I had to close the door. And I quietly taught them stacking math. At the end of the semester, the end of the term, they had the standardized tests. My kids scored the best in the entire diocese. And I got an award. And I couldn't tell them how I did it. When May rolled around, I was lying to them. I quit. You know, in Wisconsin, one of the things that's most puzzling about this, and this is another thing to worry about, it is amazing how many private Christian schools, private Catholic schools, have leapt to the front of the line to take Common Core without being asked. It is staggering. And I talked to 4 of the 5 bishops in Wisconsin, and they had no idea what Common Core was. I mean, bishops are doing bishop things, right? They're traveling, they're pastoral care. They've got secular educators. And in most instances in Wisconsin, most of the bishops, the people doing education, were in those dioceses well before those bishops rotated in. These are people who are taking, and they slipped it in without anybody knowing. It's absolutely staggering when you think about it. Now, I'll say this in Wisconsin, those bishops that we talked to, they're absolutely mortified by this. Absolutely mortified by this. Again, like with the public schools, they're so far in the classrooms, though, you can't just stop it. And so the bishops are figuring out how to do it. I had one Bishop of Madison I spoke with, and I tried to explain, because what all the private school people say is, well, we can adopt Common Core, and we can make it Christian, or we can make it Catholic. We can take what's there. We can make it seem like we're going along, and then Christianize it. And it's kind of hyperbolic, but the metaphor I use, it's like inviting the devil into your living room, and then telling everybody, it's okay. We got him on a leash, no problem, right? Why? You already outperformed them. I told the Bishop Morlino, God bless him, he gets it. Told him, I don't know if I should be mentioning his name, just did. He gets it. In fact, before I even began my little talk, he was giving me all the reasons he thought it was a bad idea. But he said to me, we pointed out to him, and he reinforced this. Why are our Catholic moms and dads paying thousands and thousands of dollars a year for curriculum that is essentially the same public school curriculum? What is the difference here? Why would we do this? And you got to be careful, because I would bet you that probably 70 to 80% of our private schools have already adopted Common Core without being asked to. Here's a question for us. Why? Why not? If you think it's great, why not wait? You're going to see in a couple of years what this is. Why are we rushing to the front of the line? You know what it is? Our Christian education is much more worried about keeping up with the public schools than it is about faith formation. That's the problem, right? And and just like in the public schools, there are a lot of good people in the Catholic educational hierarchies. You know that's true too, or the Protestant or the Christian ones. All that's true. But ultimately, it becomes a matter of we're ahead of them, and we have to stay ahead of them. If we're going to continue to get people to pay money to come to us, we have to continue to exceed the standards. So we take the standards and we try to Christianize them. It's you get that it's exactly the opposite, right? They secularize our curriculum. All right, so be very careful about that. So moving forward then a little bit. Here, I had to pull this one for you. We've seen grit, tenacity, and perseverance. We've seen sex skills, and now we see competencies. That's what we want out of our kids. By the way, there's a movement, already it's being drafted, a movement in Washington by the curriculum committees here, to replace A, B, C, D grading with the 2 simple words, proficient or not proficient. Yeah, you get that. You see what that does? Do you see how some of you are tisk-tisking that? You're hard-hearted people, all right? Don't you see if we get A is higher than a B is higher than a C is? Well, what if you were a D student? You'd feel bad about that. Well, you see what's happening all over the country. The elimination of valedictorians. Why should one kid get to be the valedictorian? Elimination of honors programs, and that's going to happen big time. If there's a one-size-fits-all standard, you cannot have honors kids. You cannot have high-achieving kids. Lewis said it. That kid who could move forward, he can't be allowed to because it hurts people's feelings. It's not fair. And the one area where you see radical liberal and conservative agreement on Common Core is special needs kids. The people who are on the left who are most upset about this, learning disability kids, special needs kids, because not only are you never going to get them to the standard, by definition, you can't have them part of the rubric because they're going to pull it down. So we're on the verge of moving to a system where they're already starting to farm special need kids out of the public schools, right? And of course, if history holds true, the next step is institutionalization. Has to be, right? And we've seen that historically. All right? So, but this is an old 1950s style Soviet flow chart, all right, that talks about all of this non-educational stuff, right? Those old 5-year planning and competency. We don't want educated kids. We don't want high-achieving kids. We want competent, proficient kids. Drones for the workforce. And we've already done a good job, I think, talking about how Common Core affects homeschooling. We've already done a pretty good job about this, but I would say a few more things about this. How many of you know the name of the Remmelke family? Almost a few of you. The Remmelke family is a German family. They're a conservative evangelical Christian homeschool family. Homeschoolers. And Germany. I don't know how many of you know this, but the American public education system was put in place by Horace Mann, and it was modeled exclusively after the proto-fascist Prussian system of education. Our school systems ultimately were modeled after what went on in Prussia, the precursor of Weimar, World War I and World War II Germany. The Prussians were a very authoritarian state, top-down education, standard-based education, and this educational system that we have, it's problematic in this sense. The Prussians, the Remmelkes, how do I phrase this? The first thing the Nazis did, 3 of the first 4 things the Nazis did when they took office: absolute gun control, socialized medicine, and a ban on homeschooling. Those were 3 of the first 4 laws enacted by the Nazis. Gun control, national health care, and no homeschooling. After World War II, the Germans expunged every single Nazi law, every one of them except one: the ban on homeschooling. The Remmelkes wanted to educate their kids in a Christian way. They were facing federal prison and the confiscation of their kids. They emigrated here, and now they're being deported. The same president and Attorney General Eric Holder, 2 months ago, lectured Americans and said, "We have a moral and ethical responsibility to grant immediate citizenship to anyone who's crossed the southern borders. It is their civil rights," Attorney General Holder said. "We owe them that." And yet, one single German homeschool family is going through the lengthy process of deportation. Homeschool Legal Defense Association has taken up their case, and it's going to end up in the Supreme Court. But this is a government that has stopped enforcing federal law when it comes to illegal immigrants. Won't even enforce it. Won't ask any questions. And yet one German homeschool family is in the process of being deported. The objective here, and again, it doesn't take much to look ahead. And that's what's so frustrating about our Christian schools and how quick they are to rush to the forefront of this. They're, participating in their own demise. Because if you're already saying, you want to know what? We do want your curriculum. You want to know what? This curriculum put together by secularists and atheists and humanists, this curriculum that is anti-theistic and anti-truth, we want that for our schools without being asked. And it's amazing how the school administrators, not the bishops and the priests know very little about this. It's amazing, at least the ones we've talked to, it's amazing how these school officials defend this. This is the problem. And so you see what's going to happen with homeschool. That if and when these tests are national, all these things happen, then there can be no room for homeschool. Any more than ultimately there's going to be room for Christian schools. The president, I may have mentioned it, the president was in Ireland. Did we talk about that? Yeah, 2,000 kids, Protestant Catholic, and he said, we got to get beyond this. No, this was in the summer. President Obama said to a group of 2,000 Irish kids, some Protestants, some Catholics, he said to them, we've got to get beyond this sense of you Catholics having your schools and you Protestants having your schools. You need to become one nation and put that stuff aside, one education, right? You see what's coming down the road with this. It's impossible not to see it, all right? I should make a quick mention of this. The longitudinal databases, the current impact of the Common Core on home and private education is revealed in the expanding state longitudinal databases, all this data collection. Shifting college admissions expectations, the exams are all being rewritten, newly updated curricula, and revised standardized tests. All these are fulfilling education historian. Diane Ravitch is a liberal educator, by the way. She is no right-winger. All these are fulfilling education historian Diane Ravitch's prediction that no one will escape the Common Core's reach. No one will escape it, whether they attend public or private schools. And then, perhaps the most immediate threat to homeschool is these databases. We've talked a little bit about that data collection. We've already talked about the SAT. Here are some of those passages in Obamacare. You can get them at our website if you want to see them, where they tie all these emotional and healthcare arguments to what goes on in schools and how schools become recruited to be information gathering places. And here's another thing. If you keep your kid home or send him to a private school, you are not exempt from Obamacare. It's the law, which means the information the public schools are collecting on your kids, the state is by law entitled to it, which means you're going to have to give it to them, right? You can't just have a system. If Obamacare is the law for the whole country, you can't just say, my kids don't go to public schools, I don't have to conform to that. I hope you will say that in a massive act of civil disobedience. I don't think they're going to pay much attention to it. Another problem. Here's the guy we mentioned, Michael Barber, Sir Michael Barber. He owns Pearson Publishing, CEO. He owns 100% of the Canadian textbook market. 100%. He owns 80% now, upwards of 80% of the American textbook market. If you've been reading the Wall Street Journal, Barber has been buying up American publishing houses, textbook houses, paying sometimes 3 and 5 times what they're worth because he wants the same monopoly. He is a big Agenda 21 guy, huge supporter of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, also gave huge dollars to the Common Core testing. In fact, his agency is going to be making money off the Common Core test. It is getting increasingly difficult to find any textbooks that are not completely Common Core aligned. So even in a few years, if you want to educate your kids in a non-Common Core way, where are you going to go for the textbooks? Again, it's not a national curriculum, but the entire textbook industry, even Bob Jones University homeschool curriculum. Bob Jones, you remember them, right? The arch right-wing college. Even their homeschool information has become not Common Core friendly, but minimally Common Core compliant. We understand why. When the government buys textbooks, they pay a lot more for them than worth, right? The government pays a lot more for everything than it's worth. So all these publishing houses realize when there's all this competition out there, and moms and dads can have a say in picking their textbooks at the homeschool level, well, that keeps diversity going. But this curriculum is going to take that all away. You're already seeing it with the textbooks. Bob Jones University Press has issued a recall for any pre-Common Core versions of their textbooks, and they're not going to let any more be sold because all that federal money there is there to be had, right? And we have not even talked about the cost of this implementation and test. The word trillion, we've reached a bad state in this country when the word trillion doesn't mean anything anymore. I'm young enough to remember when $1 billion was a big deal, right? I remember when $1 million was a lot. $1 billion was unfathomable. Now, yeah, the costs of this are staggering, but it's crony capitalism, isn't it? Companies like GE, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, all these big banks that are associated with the implementation of all this stuff, they're all the big donors behind this, and they stand to reap infinite windfalls from it. All right, that's just some more Pearson stuff. Quickly, what do? I want to make a couple comments, and we're almost done, about another 5 minutes. There are alternatives. First, I mentioned that upwards of 20 states in the union are in the position now of beginning to move away from this. We all got such a late start because of how they rolled them out, but it's happening. My own state, Wisconsin, which is not quite as left-wing as your guys' state, but it's out there. We're having the conversations now. The fact that 1,000 people show up to protest Superintendent King is a good thing. You've got to keep doing this. And the arrogance, right? That's none of your business. It's our decision to make. That, I don't care what your politics are, that should stagger you into action. Let me also mention, we've got out in the hallway some interesting curriculum. I want to mention Freedom Project Education. That's the school that I designed the curriculum for. Free information there. Also want to mention Augustine Classical Academy. We've got a lot of people here from Augustine. Man, that's the answer. Small schools, absolutely Christian-based in faith, classical curriculum, right? Small in the sense that they are not going to be co-opted. Take a look at that curriculum. Don't overwhelm our poor friend back there who's heading the table, but look at it. The way this is going to get fixed is moms and dads now beginning to recognize that you're the educators. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to quit your job or mom has to quit her job, but it means you've got to start making education more of a local thing, a community thing, right? Getting together with people on your block or in your neighborhood and alternating and finding ways to make this happen while you still can do this. Take a look at Augustine, take a look at Freedom Project. There's a couple other great educators back there. I hate to say this again, and this is not an infomercial, which is why I've told you nothing about my curriculum. But I mean this. The more you keep your kids in these schools, and if we defeat Common Core, if we roll it back, all that means is 10 years, 5 years from now, they're going to roll it out again. Find some other euphemism, happiness education or something. Happy education. And and they're not going to stop, right? There's a war raging in our Christian and Catholic schools. I think we can pull that back. I think that once the clergy, once the pastors don't know either. Once the pastors, once the elders, once the priests, the bishops, once they know, they're going to want no part of this. It's going to take will to pull it out. But on the public level, turning this back from the inside is hard. What we have to do is establish a viable educational system outside the public one. That will force change from the public school when they see what they're losing. God bless you all. Thank you very much for being here tonight. Well done.